You can find all sorts of articles and studies online that hit on this very interesting issue that reading literature, reading novels, reading literary fiction increases the reader's capacity for empathy, which we could argue is something we need a lot in today's world. And it's the lack of empathy that has led to a lot of the violence, mistrust, and anger that we all sometimes feel like we're living in the midst of. So I just pulled up kind of an easy blog type post here about the idea that reading fiction can increase your empathy. And so it starts out, I'm going to scroll here, hang on, by saying that there is a 2013 study from the New School, and it concludes that reading literature improves theory of mind. And basically that means the capacity to identify and understand others' subjective states. As the authors note, theory of mind is critically linked to empathy, that all-important ability to intuit and experience the feelings of another. So then in the next paragraph, I quite like the part where they say that literary fiction has the power to disrupt our stereotypes, and what's more, it's full of complicated individuals whose inner lives are rarely easily discerned, but warrant exploration. So what they're saying is we get some complex characters. I mean, if they're well written, we're talking about characters that could be real people. And that means you have to unpack them a little bit. You have to examine them and think about them a little bit to make sense of them. And that is definitely true, I think, in this week's stories. Well, in all the stories, but in particular, I would say, you've got 3 stories you're reading this week. And in at least 2 of them, we have sort of enigmatic characters we're thinking about, and in particular when it comes to their family relationships. So hey, if you've looked at the checklist for week 4, you will see these things you're taking care of in terms of the assignments for the week. But yeah, here are your 3 readings. The Next Life by Peter Ho Davies, A Family Supper by Kazuo Ishiguro, and Jewish Christmas by Faye Moskowitz. And I think in terms of the idea of having characters that maybe disrupt stereotypes or make you think new ways about stuff you might have taken for granted. All 3 stories are offering you some opportunities. And in The Next Life by Peter Ho Davies, we have sort of a father-son dynamic that's interesting. In A Family Supper, yeah, we got a whole family. I tell you, I read that story with its kind of weird atmosphere, and it doesn't make me long for family gatherings. And then in Jewish Christmas, I think for many of us who believe that the United States is a Christian country, which in some of its founding principles it certainly was, but in terms of the fact that it's always pulled people from all around the world with different religions, no, it's never been sheerly a Christian nation. It's been a mixed bag. But I think we learn when we read that, if you came up in the Christian tradition, you learn, oh, hey, wait a minute. Other people in the country have struggled with the way we have imposed Christianity over all of our expectations of things. So these are 3 good reads in terms of getting your brain to wake up, not just to looking at things like who's the narrator, what's the point of view, how is the plot structured, but to actually sort of cracking open some things inside of yourself that could make you, I know it sounds smarmy, but could make you a better person in the future, because you will have witnessed experiences outside of just those that you've lived. So I have 3 questions here, one for each of the stories you've read this week. And if you're someone who writes journals, these could be prompts for you this week. They're just good things to think about that are kind of stem out of the stories that we're reading, that could be very personal to you and ask you to do some internal reflection that could develop some awarenesses in you. So for the first story, one question that you might want to think about is, what do we learn about ourselves only in the absence of our parents? So we've got the father-son relationship, and we have the father who cast a long shadow. He was a big presence, and the son was more dutiful towards him than demonstrative, but now this son is like inheriting, and he's got to plan the big funeral. And I think he learned some things about himself that day. of the funeral. But if his father had been there, if his father were still alive, some of these awarenesses wouldn't have come to him. And I mean, I know, for all parents, when your kids are little, first they're physically near to you, and then you try to keep them emotionally and mentally near to you for as long as you can. They're your people. But the whole thing about being a teenager and a young adult and growing up is that you're also growing away. You're finding your own space and your own identity that isn't just relational to your parents. So once you step far enough away from your parents, you see your own self more clearly. And that's a pretty exciting time of life. And so I would just say one thing you might want to consider is the ways that having the guardians in your life, the adults in your life, whether or not you have mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, guardians, whoever's fetched you up and been responsible for you throughout your life. What kinds of things did you learn when you weren't around them about yourself? I think that's kind of fascinating. For the next story, the family supper story, you might consider this idea. How are we cast into roles within our own families? How do our roles shift depending on who we're with in our families? So sometimes, you've got one kid who is the loud one and one kid who's, he's so energetic, it drives me up a wall. And then, she's such an actress, or, he's an introvert, he's a reader. So you kind of become this certain kind of person within the dynamic of your family. But maybe it's when your whole family is together. And when it's just two siblings together, the way you talk to each other changes, the dynamic changes. I have two kids and I know they're one way together. And they're very different when it's like just me and one of them. So I just think in terms of sort of like mentally drawing those lines amongst family members, and see, like, you might be one kind of person when you're with one person in your family. And when there's two or three of the people in your family, you become a little bit different. Your energy changes, your topics change. So it's kind of cool, I think, to consider the ways that our family dynamics shift and change, and how we end up often enjoying being away from our family so that we can kind of explore being a different kind of person. We get to break out of the roles we've been cast into. And then for the third story, the Jewish Christmas, I've noticed over the years of teaching this story that students often have a moment of like it didn't occur to me that if you're Jewish in the United States, you might feel like the way you celebrate holidays is subsumed by that big energy of Christmas. And I think that would be true if you are Muslim, if you are Hindu, no matter what religion, if you're atheist, of course, no matter, what your spiritual beliefs are, there is a thing where sort of the commodification of some of our holidays, and just the fact that the rituals, the talk of them is so embedded in our culture everywhere. You don't realize that some people don't live what you are living. And so I think actually this question here on the screen is a super important one just for being a good citizen in today's times, because we have lots of race discussions and it's about time. And we need to do a lot of waking up and a lot of like, oh, wow, I didn't realize it was like that for, a certain group. So I think that developing that kind of external awareness that goes beyond our own lived experience is essential to being the best possible citizen you can be in a society where we do have a lot of sort of shared compacts about how we should treat each other and what we can expect of each other. So you could take this sort of somewhat lighthearted, this sort of simple story about Jewish Christmas, and you could, in fact, try and think about different ways that you can realize, wow, I actually centered all my perceptions of something in the world based around what I have lived. And I never realized that it's not like that for everyone else. So these are three questions I'd say, might spur you into deeper thought this week. And remember that every time you're reading fiction, in fact, it can be changing your reality.